The galaxy in the 41st millennium groans under the weight of unending war, yet even among the countless tales of blood and betrayal, few scenes inspire such horror as the sight of a Primarch standing alone among the corpses of his own sons. On the nameless world of Korthak Prime, at the very edge of the Eye of Terror, where reality bleeds into nightmare, Angron the Red Angel stood motionless in a field of crimson armor and shattered bone. The demon Primarch's massive form cast a shadow across the battlefield, his wings spread wide like a monument to slaughter, steam rising from the gore that coated his ancient blade. The world-eaters who lay scattered at his feet had been his own. These were not the corpses of enemies or rival legions, but the broken bodies of warriors who had followed him across 10,000 years of warfare. Their blood, still warm beneath the alien sun, painted the scorched earth in patterns that spoke of rage unleashed without purpose or target. Some had fallen with their weapons still raised, others with expressions of confusion frozen on their faces, as if they could not comprehend why their gene father had turned his fury upon them. The killing had been swift, efficient, and utterly without mercy. Angron's breathing came in ragged gasps, each exhalation sending wisps of demon smoke curling from his nostrils. His armor, baroque and twisted by decades of warp taint, gleamed with fresh blood that had not yet begun to dry. The massive chain axes Gore-Child and Gore-Father lay discarded beside him, their teeth still spinning lazily, as the machine spirits within them slowly wound down from their recent feast. Yet for all the carnage that surrounded him, for all the evidence of the massacre he had wrought, something unprecedented was happening within the Red Angel's mind. The butcher's nails, those ancient cybernetic tormentors that had driven him to madness for over a century, had fallen silent. The absence of pain struck him like a physical blow. For decades beyond counting, the implants had filled his skull with their constant, screaming demand for violence. They had been his eternal companions, more reliable than any brother, more persistent than any enemy. When he slept, they denied him rest. When he fought, they demanded more blood. When he tried to think, they flooded his consciousness with white-hot agony that could only be soothed by the act of killing. Yet now, in this moment of ultimate horror, they offered nothing but an empty, echoing silence that terrified him more than their worst torments ever had. Angron staggered backward, his massive frame trembling as he pressed both hands to his skull. The ornate vox grills that had been surgically grafted over the nail's entry points felt cold beneath his touch, no longer radiating the familiar heat of constantly firing neural pathways. He could feel his hearts beating, both of them, with a steady rhythm that seemed almost alien in its regularity. When had he last noticed the sound of his own pulse? When had the nails last allowed him such clarity of thought? The demon Primarch's enhanced senses, no longer filtered through a haze of artificial rage, began to process his surroundings with startling acuity. He could smell the metallic tang of spilled blood, yes, but also the ozone scent of the world's alien atmosphere and the distant sulfur that marked the boundary between real space and the warp. He could hear the low moan of wind across the battlefield, the settling of cooling metal, and something else, a sound so foreign to his experience that it took him several moments to identify it. Silence. True, complete silence within his own mind. The realization hit him with the force of a thunderhawk's impact. He was thinking, not calculating the most efficient path to his next victim, not analyzing the tactical dispositions of enemy forces, but actually thinking with the kind of clarity he had not possessed since his youth in the fighting pits of Nuceria. The thought should have been liberating, yet instead it filled him with a creeping dread that made his demon flesh crawl. Without the nail's constant pressure, memories long suppressed began to stir in the depths of his consciousness, like sediment disturbed in still water. They came first as fragments, disconnected images that made no immediate sense. The flash of sunlight on red sand, the taste of recycled air in underground chambers, the sound of chains rattling against stone, and beneath it all, threading through these scattered recollections like a melody half-remembered, the echo of a voice he had not heard in over a century. A woman's voice, calling his name. The demon Primarch's head snapped up, his burning eyes scanning the empty battlefield, as if expecting to see the owner of that voice standing among the corpses of his sons. But there was nothing, only the endless expanse of alien soil and the distant mountains that marked the horizon. Yet the memory persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment, carrying with it emotions that his demonic nature should have long since purged. Warmth, companionship, something that might once have been called love. Angron fell to one knee, the impact sending tremors through the ground and causing several of the nearby corpses to shift position with wet, sliding sounds. His claws, each one longer than a mortal man's forearm, dug furrows in the dirt as he struggled to maintain his balance. The absence of rage left him feeling hollow, as if some essential part of his being had been carved away. For so long, fury had been his strength, his purpose, his very identity. Without it, what was he but a broken thing, a tool that had outlived its purpose? The voice in his memory grew clearer, speaking words in the old Nucerian dialect that he had not heard since his transformation. He could not yet make out what she was saying, but the tone carried comfort and determination in equal measure. It was the voice of someone who had stood beside him in the arena, who had shared his dreams of freedom, who had— The memory shattered as Angron's demon nature reasserted itself, flooding his system with unnatural strength and purpose. His form blazed with unholy light as the warp energies that sustained him flared in response to his distress. Yet even as his supernatural power surged, the nails remained silent, leaving him trapped between his mortal recollections and his demonic reality. He was neither fully man nor fully monster, but something caught between them, a being experiencing emotions he had thought forever lost. For the first time in decades, Angron wept. The tears that fell from his burning eyes hissed as they struck the ground, leaving tiny craters in the alien soil. Each drop carried with it the weight of a century's worth of suppressed grief, regret, and loss. He wept for his fallen sons, whose loyalty he had repaid with slaughter. He wept for the countless innocents who had fallen beneath his axes. But most of all, he wept for the growing certainty that the voice in his memory belonged to someone he had failed to save, someone whose face he could almost, but not quite, remember. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant rumble of orbital debris falling through the planet's atmosphere. Somewhere in the ruins of the hive city they had been assaulting, the surviving World Eaters would be wondering why their Primarch's rage had suddenly ceased, why the psychic network that bound them to his fury had gone dark. Some would come looking for him eventually, and when they did, Angron knew he would have to provide answers he did not possess. But for now, in this moment of unprecedented quiet, he remained on his knees among the corpses of his sons, listening to the echo of a woman's voice and feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. The butcher's nails were silent, and in that silence, Angron began to remember what it meant to be human. The weight of silence pressed upon Angron like the gravity of a dying star, crushing and inescapable. He had never realized how much of his existence had been defined by the nails' constant screaming until they fell quiet. Now, kneeling among the corpses of his sons, the demon Primarch found himself reaching desperately for the familiar embrace of rage, clawing at the empty spaces in his mind where fury should have dwelt. Yet where once an ocean of wrath had surged through his consciousness, he found only a hollow void that echoed with the ghost of his own breathing. Angron rose to his feet with deliberate slowness, his massive frame casting shifting shadows across the blood-soaked ground. His hands moved to the hafts of Gore-Child and Gore-Father, fingers closing around the worn grips that had been shaped by millennia of slaughter. The chain axes felt strange in his grasp, not lighter, but somehow different, as if they belonged to someone else. He triggered their activation runes, and the weapons roared to life with their familiar hungry growling, teeth spinning in anticipation of fresh carnage. Yet even as the blessed sound filled the air, Angron felt nothing. No surge of anticipation, no quickening of his pulse, no desperate need to find something to kill. The realization struck him with cold precision. The rage was not merely absent, it had been replaced by something far more terrifying. Clarity. For the first time in over a century, Angron could think without the constant interference of artificial fury, and the thoughts that came unbidden to his mind were not of battle plans or tactical dispositions, but of memories he had believed lost forever. The vision came without warning, superimposing itself over the alien landscape like a double-exposed pict capture. Red sand beneath a harsh yellow sun. The smell of sweat and fear and spilled blood mingling with the acrid smoke of burning incense. Stone walls that rose high enough to block out everything but a narrow slice of sky, painted with the purple hues of distant mountains. The gladiatorial pits of Nuceria, where he had been forged into a weapon long before the Emperor had claimed him as a son. But this memory was different from the few that had survived the nail's installation. Those had been fragments of pain and rage, moments of triumph or defeat that the cybernetic implants had allowed him to retain because they served their purpose of fueling his anger. This vision carried with it sensations the nails should have burned away, the warmth of camaraderie, the bitter taste of hope deferred, and most surprisingly, the sound of laughter echoing off stone walls. Angron's enhanced hearing detected the approach of survivors before his scattered thoughts could fully process the memory. Heavy footsteps crunched through debris and cooling blood, accompanied by the distinctive whine of power armor servos under stress. 3 world eaters rounded the twisted remains of what had once been an Imperial rhino, their red armor splattered with gore that was not their own. They moved with the cautious gait of predators, approaching something that might still be dangerous, bolt pistols held ready but not quite aimed at their primarch. The sergeant who led them was Kargoth, a warrior whose scarred face bore the ritual brands of the Devourers. He had served Angron for over 6 decades, had stood at his side when they burned the forge worlds of Talasar, and had been among the first to undergo the implantation of the nails when the Legion began its descent into madness. Yet now he approached his Gene Father with visible uncertainty, his helmet sensors sweeping the battlefield as if searching for some hidden threat that might explain why the Red Angel stood motionless among his victims. "My lord?" Kargoth's voice carried the electronic distortion of his vox grill, but beneath the mechanical undertones, Angron could detect something that should have been impossible. Fear. Not the fear of an enemy or of death. World Eaters had long since purged such weaknesses from their ranks, but the deeper terror of a son confronting a father who was no longer recognizable. Angron turned toward the sound, and the movement sent fresh waves of memory cascading through his consciousness, not of battlefields or conquests, but of a different kind of turning. The slow pivot of a fighter, acknowledging a challenge in the arena, aware that death waited in every direction, but determined to face it with dignity intact. The memory brought with it a face, glimpsed for just an instant before it dissolved back into the depths of his suppressed past. A woman's face, strong-featured and scarred, with eyes that held defiance even in the depths of slavery. She had been watching him from across the sand, and when their gazes met, she had smiled with such fierce pride that it had kindled something in his chest that the High Rider's torches hadn't been able to extinguish. Her name came to him like a whisper from the grave. Thyra. "The battle is won, my lord," Kargoth continued when Angron offered no immediate response. The sergeant's weapon remained ready, though he held it with the practiced ease of a warrior, trying not to appear threatening. "The Hive City has fallen. Our brothers await your orders for the next phase of the campaign." The demon Primarch's burning gaze fixed upon Kargoth with an intensity that made the veteran marine take an involuntary step backward. Yet this was not the familiar fire of barely contained rage that had defined Angron's attention for so many decades. This was something colder, more calculating, and infinitely more disturbing. It was the gaze of a mind that was actually thinking, processing, remembering. Angron's attention shifted from his sons to the debris field that surrounded them. The battle had been brutal but brief. A World-Eater's assault left few survivors to contest the aftermath. Yet among the scattered wreckage of vehicles and fortifications, something caught his enhanced vision. A glint of metal that seemed somehow familiar, half buried beneath the twisted remains of a Lehman Russ battle tank. Without explanation, he moved toward the object, his massive frame navigating the destruction with surprising grace. The artifact was small, no larger than a man's fist, its surface covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow when observed directly. It was undeniably human in origin, yet ancient beyond measure. Pre-Imperial, possibly even dating to the dark age of technology. As Angron's claws closed around the device, he felt a subtle resonance, as if the metal itself was vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. The moment his skin made contact with the artifact's surface, the world exploded into sensation. Not the crude neural firing of the butcher's nails, but something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. Images flooded his consciousness with overwhelming force, memories that had been locked away for so long that experiencing them felt like drowning in liquid fire. Thyra stood before him once again, no longer a half-remembered ghost, but a living presence so vivid that Angron could count the individual scars that marked her arms and shoulders. She wore the simple tunic of a gladiator slave, dyed red with her own blood from the arena. Yet she carried herself with the bearing of a queen. Her dark hair hung in braids, decorated with small bones, trophies taken from opponents she had killed in single combat. When she spoke, her voice carried the accent of Nuceria's mountain tribes, softened by years in the fighting pits, but never fully domesticated. "The High Riders think they own us," she was saying, her words carrying across decades to strike Angron's consciousness like physical blows. "They think because they hold our chains, they hold our souls. But they're wrong, brother. They can break our bodies, but they cannot break what we are. Not unless we let them." The memory fragmented as Angron's demon nature fought against the intrusion of human emotion. His form blazed with unholy light, wings spreading wide as warp energies surged through his transfigured flesh. Yet even as his supernatural power flared in response to distress, the butcher's nails remained stubbornly silent. The artifact in his grasp grew warm, its geometric patterns shifting more rapidly, as if responding to the psychic turbulence that surrounded him. Kargoth and his companions had raised their weapons, though none seemed certain what threat they were preparing to face. Their Primarch stood wreathed in demonic fire, yet he made no move to attack. Instead, he simply stood there, staring at the small device in his palm as if it held the secrets of the universe. For warriors accustomed to their Gene Father's explosive rages and immediate violence, this stillness was more terrifying than any battlefield they had ever walked. "My lord," Kargoth ventured again, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "What are your orders?" Angron looked up from the artifact, and for a moment the burning coals of his eyes seemed almost human. When he spoke, His voice carried none of its usual thunder, none of the inhuman resonance that had marked his speech since his transformation into a demon prince. Instead, it held only the quiet weight of a man confronting truths he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. "She had a name," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "They all had names, and I have forgotten them. All of them except hers." The World Eaters exchanged glances, their helmets' optic sensors tracking between their Primarch and each other in obvious confusion. In all their years of service, they had never heard their Gene Father speak of anyone with such careful reverence. The Red Angel's past was a subject of speculation and legend among the Legion's ranks, but Angron himself had never spoken of it with anything approaching sentimentality. "Thyra," Angron continued, his gaze returning to the artifact. "Her name was Thyra, and she died because I failed her." The admission hung in the air like an accusation, and for the first time in his existence as a demon Primarch, Angron felt the full weight of genuine remorse. The butcher's nails had protected him from such emotions for so long that experiencing them now felt like being flayed alive. Yet beneath the pain, something else stirred, a determination that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with the quiet strength he had learned in the fighting pits of Nuceria. For the first time in over a century, Angron began to remember not just what he had lost, but who he had been before the galaxy had broken him. And in that remembering, the first seeds of an impossible idea began to take root in the depths of his transfigured soul. The artifact pulsed against Angron's palm like a living heart, and with each rhythmic surge of energy, the barriers that the butcher's nails had erected around his memories crumbled further. What had begun as fragmentary glimpses of his past now expanded into a torrent of sensation, so vivid that the present moment seemed like the pale shadow, and the distant arenas of Nuceria blazed with the intensity of absolute reality. The demon Primarch's consciousness plunged backward through decades of suppressed experience, past the transformation that had made him Khorne's champion, past the endless campaigns of the Horus heresy, past even his discovery by the Emperor, until he stood once again in the blood-soaked sand of the fighting pits, where his soul had been forged in equal measures of suffering and defiance. The young man he had been then bore little resemblance to the transfigured monster he had become, yet the memories carried with them emotions so pure and undiluted that they burned through his demonic essence like acid through armor. He had been barely more than a child when the slavers found him, though his Primarch physiology had already begun to manifest in ways that set him apart from common humanity. The High Riders of Deshea had recognized his potential immediately, not as a son of the Emperor, for that truth lay centuries in the future, but as a weapon to be shaped and honed for their entertainment. They had given him a name that translated roughly as "slave who brings profit," but among his fellow gladiators he had been known simply as Angronius, and later, when his reputation grew, as the Lord of the Red Sands. Yet even in those earliest days, when his rage was still his own and not the product of cybernetic torture, he had never fought alone. From his first tentative steps onto the arena floor, Thyra had been there. Not as a romantic attachment, for such concepts held little meaning in the brutal world of the fighting pits, but as something far more precious. She had been his conscience, his anchor to the humanity that their captors sought so desperately to strip away. The memory crystallized around their first meeting with such clarity that Angron could smell the stale air of the slave quarters and feel the rough stone beneath his feet. He had been perhaps 15 standard years old, already towering over his fellow captives, but still uncertain of his place in the hierarchy of survival that governed their existence. The older gladiators had tested him that first night, as was their custom with newcomers, seeking to establish whether he would be predator or prey in the savage ecosystem of the pits. Thyra had stepped between him and his tormentors, not with physical force. She was perhaps a third his size, even then, but with words that cut deeper than any blade. "You want to fight something?" she had asked the largest of his would-be assailants. "Fight the High Riders. Fight the ones who put us in these cages. Don't waste your strength bleeding each other when our true enemies watch from their golden boxes and laugh." The intervention should have earned her a beating, or worse. Instead, it had sparked something that the masters of the arena had not anticipated and could never truly understand. It had been the first ember of what would eventually become a rebellion that shook the foundations of Nucerian society. But in that moment, it was simply the friendship between two souls who refused to surrender their humanity to the machinery of oppression. Their training had been brutal beyond description. Each dawn brought fresh torments designed to strip away everything that made them human and leave behind only efficient killing machines. They learned to fight with every weapon the arena could provide: gladius and net, chain blade and power maul, even the crude firearms that the crowd particularly enjoyed. They were taught to ignore pain, to embrace violence, to find joy in the moment when an opponent's life flickered out beneath their hands. Yet in the stolen hours between training sessions, when the guards dozed and the overseers counted their profits, Thyra and Angronius had forged bonds that transcended the artificial savagery of their circumstances. She taught him the mountain songs of her homeland, half-remembered melodies that spoke of wide skies and freedom beyond the reach of any master's whip. He shared with her the strange dreams that came to him in the depths of sleep, visions of distant stars and golden palaces that felt more real than the stone walls of their prison. Together they had planned for a future that seemed impossible. Not mere escape, for even if they could breach the arena's defenses, where could slaves hope to hide on a world where their very existence was marked by brands and scars? No, what they dreamed of was something far more audacious, the complete overthrow of the system that had created them. They would not flee from their chains, they would break them, and then forge new ones for the necks of their former masters. The rebellion, when it finally came, had been glorious in its fury and tragic in its scope. Thyra's tactical brilliance had complemented Angronius's raw combat prowess, creating a force that the High Riders had been utterly unprepared to face. City after city had fallen to their growing army of liberated slaves, and for a brief, shining moment, it had seemed as if the impossible dream might actually become reality. Yet even as the memories played out before him with perfect clarity, Angron's demon form remained anchored in the present, kneeling on the blood-soaked soil of a world he had never seen before this day. The juxtaposition was maddening. To feel the warmth of Nuceria's twin suns on his skin, while simultaneously experiencing the alien cold of Korthak Prime's atmosphere. The artifact continued to pulse in his grasp, its ancient mechanisms working to unlock memories that had been sealed away for over a century. But the effort was taking a visible toll on his transfigured physiology. Kargoth and his warriors had backed away from their Primarch, recognizing the signs of some internal struggle, but lacking the context to understand its nature. They had seen Angron in the grip of rage countless times, had witnessed his demon form unleash destruction that reduced continents to ash. But this was something entirely different. This was not the explosive fury of Khorne's champion, but the quiet agony of a mind rediscovering its own capacity for genuine emotion. Steam began to rise from Angron's massive frame as the conflict between memory and reality intensified. His demon essence, sustained by rage and violence for so long, found itself poisoned by feelings that belonged to a different existence entirely. Love, hope, the bitter sweetness of shared dreams, these were toxins to his supernatural nature. Yet they flooded through his consciousness with the inexorable force of a dam finally giving way after decades of pressure. The visions continued to unfold, each memory more vivid than the last. He could see Thyra as she had been in those final days before the Emperor's arrival, No longer the frightened girl he had first met in the slave quarters, but a woman transformed by war into something magnificent. She had stood atop the walls of Deshaya's capital, her hair streaming in the wind as she directed the final assault against the High Rider's stronghold. In that moment, she had been everything that Angronius himself aspired to become. A liberator, a symbol of hope, a living proof that those born in chains could rise to challenge the stars themselves. But beneath the glory of that memory lay the poison that would eventually destroy them all. Even as Thyra planned their ultimate victory, fate was moving to snatch it away. The Emperor's arrival had not been the salvation that some of their followers had imagined it might be. Instead, it had been the cruelest betrayal of all. Not the intervention of a god come to aid their cause, but the theft of their greatest asset at the moment when victory hung within their grasp. The demon Primarch's physical form began to convulse as the weight of suppressed grief finally broke through the barriers that had contained it. His wings folded inward as if to shield him from the assault of his own memories, and the baleful light that typically surrounded him flickered and dimmed like a candle guttering in a strong wind. For the first time since his transformation, Angron appeared diminished, vulnerable, almost mortal. "She trusted me," he whispered, his voice so soft that even his enhanced warriors had to strain to hear it. "They all trusted me, and I left them to die. I could have said no. I could have fought the Emperor, forced him to choose between taking me and saving them. But I was weak. I chose my own survival over their freedom." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Angron felt their truth settle into his bones with the weight of absolute certainty. He had spent over a century telling himself that he had been taken against his will, that the Emperor's teleportation had given him no choice in the matter. Yet now, with his memories restored to their full clarity, he could see the moment for what it truly was. Not an abduction, but an escape. He had been given the chance to leave behind the responsibility of leadership, to trade the uncertain hope of liberation for the guarantee of personal power, and he had taken it. The realization struck him with such force that his physical form finally succumbed to the trauma. The Daemon Primarch collapsed forward, his massive frame hitting the ground with an impact that sent tremors through the surrounding area. The artifact tumbled from his grasp, its geometric pattern still shifting as residual energy discharged into the alien soil. For a moment, the only sound was the labored breathing of a being caught between two states of existence, neither fully daemon nor fully human, but something trapped in the agonizing space between them. Kargoth approached cautiously, his weapon lowered, but still ready. In all his decades of service, he had never seen anything like this. The Red Angel, champion of the blood god, laid low not by enemy action, but by the simple act of remembering what it meant to love someone more than himself. It was a sight that challenged everything the World Eaters thought they knew about strength, power, and the nature of their Gene Father's soul. "My lord," the sergeant said carefully, his voice thick with uncertainty, "what would you have us do?" Angron's burning eyes fixed upon his son, and for a moment Kargoth saw something in that gaze that he had never witnessed before. Not rage, not fury, but the deep and abiding sorrow of a man who had discovered that his greatest victory was built upon his most shameful betrayal. When the Demon Primarch spoke again, his words carried the weight of a century's worth of accumulated guilt. "Send word to the fleet," Angron commanded, his voice barely recognizable without its usual thunder. "Tell them their lord remembers what it means to grieve." The warp screamed. Across the immaterial realm that bordered reality, something that had claimed dominion over blood and slaughter for eons, felt one of its greatest champions slip from its grasp, like water through clawed fingers. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic, sending shockwaves through the chaotic currents of the Imperium that registered as psychic storms across half the galaxy. On distant worlds, astropaths collapsed, bleeding from their eyes. Navigators aboard ships traversing the warp routes felt their third eyes burn with sympathetic agony. And in the deepest reaches of the immaterial realm, where thought became substance and emotion took physical form, Khorne the Blood God turned his attention toward the world of Korthak Prime with the focused intensity of a star-going supernova. The voice, when it came, did not speak in words, but in concepts that bypassed the need for language entirely. It thundered through dimensions, crashed against the barriers between real space and the warp, and drove itself like a burning spear directly into Angron's consciousness. The demon Primarch's massive frame convulsed as his patron deity's fury found its mark, sending tremors through the ground that registered on seismic equipment in the ruined hive city kilometers away. Mine. The concept struck Angron with the force of a macro-cannon shell, carrying with it the accumulated weight of over a century's worth of service, sacrifice, and shared slaughter. Every life he had taken in Khorne's name, every world he had burned in pursuit of the Blood God's glory, every moment of rage that had defined his existence since his transformation, all of it became a chain that tightened around his soul with inexorable force. The demon essence that had replaced so much of his original biology responded to its creator's call like iron filings drawn to a magnet, threatening to tear him apart from within. Yet even as Khorne's power sought to reclaim its wayward champion, the memories that the Nucerian artifact had unlocked refused to be silenced. Thyra's face blazed in his mind's eye with a clarity that hurt to perceive, her voice echoing across the decades with words that had once given him strength in the darkest moments of their shared captivity. "They can break our bodies," she whispered through the storm of divine fury. "But they cannot break what we are. Not unless we let them." Angron struggled to his feet, his demon form wreathed in conflicting energies as two incompatible states of being warred for dominance within his transfigured flesh. His wings spread wide, no longer instruments of terrible majesty, but desperate attempts to maintain balance as psychic forces threatened to tear him in all directions at once. The burning coals that served as his eyes flickered between the hellish red of Khorne's influence and something that might almost have been human, a flicker of the man he had been before the galaxy had broken him. The effect of their Primarch's internal struggle rippled outward through the psychic network that bound the World Eaters to their Gene Father's will. Across Korthak Prime, the remaining members of the Legion felt the sudden absence of the rage that had sustained them for so long. Some collapsed where they stood, their enhanced physiology unprepared for the shock of existing without the constant stimulation of artificially induced fury. Others turned on each other with desperate savagery, seeking in violence against their own brothers the emotional release that their Primarch's stable anger had always provided. Captain Khan, veteran of 1,000 campaigns and bearer of Gorechild's twin chain axe, felt the change like a physical wound. He had been leading a sweep through the Hive City's lower levels when the psychic backlash struck, and the sudden silence where his Gene Father's rage should have been left him staggering against a wall for support. Around him, his warriors began to exhibit the telltale signs of Nail's withdrawal, trembling hands, unfocused eyes, the desperate hunger for violence that could never quite be satisfied through conventional means. "Lord Angron," Khan voxed, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "My lord, what is happening?" There was no response. The communication channel that had always carried the reassuring undertone of their Primarch's fury now transmitted only static and the occasional sound that might have been sobbing. For a warrior who had known nothing but certainty in service to the Blood God, the experience was more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced. Meanwhile, in the deepest reaches of the warp, Khorne's attention focused with ever greater intensity on the world where his champion struggled. The Blood God's rage was not the simple, clean fury of the mortal mind, elevated beyond reason. It was something far older and more terrible, the accumulated anger of every unjust death, every act of pointless violence, every moment of suffering that the galaxy's inhabitants had ever inflicted upon each other. It was the distilled essence of conflict itself, given form and purpose, and an intelligence that spanned millennia. Return to me, son of rage. Remember your purpose. The command came with visions, glimpses of the glory that awaited those who served the blood god faithfully. Angron saw himself, as he had been in the days of his greatest victories, striding across battlefields with his axes, singing their song of death, leading his sons in crusades that painted entire systems red with the blood of the innocent. He felt again the intoxicating rush of perfect violence, the moment when skill and fury combined to create something transcendent and pure. Yet even as these temptations assaulted his consciousness, another set of memories rose to meet them, not of conquest and slaughter, but of quiet moments stolen between the storms of war. Thyra sitting beside him in their shared cell, teaching him the mountain songs of her homeland, the two of them working together to plan their rebellion, each contributing their strengths to forge something greater than either could achieve alone. The fierce pride in her eyes when he proved himself worthy of the trust she had placed in him. These memories should have been powerless against the might of a chaos god. They were human things, mortal concerns that belonged to an existence that Angron had supposedly transcended through his transformation into a demon prince. Yet they held a strength that surprised even Khorne himself, not the brutal power of divine fury, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. They offered not domination, but connection, not conquest, but belonging. The artifact that had triggered this crisis continued to pulse with its own mysterious energy, its ancient mechanisms working to amplify the psychic resonance between Angron's suppressed memories and his current reality. Whatever civilization had created the device, they had possessed knowledge of the human psyche that went far beyond anything the Imperium had ever achieved. The patterns etched into its surface were not merely decorative, they were a form of psychic architecture, designed to unlock and strengthen the bonds between memory and identity that trauma had severed. Angron's demon form began to manifest the internal conflict in increasingly visible ways. Cracks of golden light appeared along his wings and limbs, not the hellish radiance of the warp, but something cleaner and infinitely more painful to perceive. Where these fractures opened, wisps of something that might have been soul stuff began to escape, carrying with them the essence of who he had been before Khorne had claimed him. You are mine. You have always been mine. These mortal affections are weakness. No, Angron whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own enhanced hearing. The single word fell into the maelstrom of competing forces like a stone cast into an ocean, yet somehow it carried weight beyond its size. She was real. What we had was real. What you gave me is just poison wearing the mask of strength. The blasphemy struck Khorne like a physical blow, sending fresh waves of fury crashing through the immaterial realm. On dozens of worlds across the galaxy, followers of the blood god felt their patron's rage as a burning pressure behind their eyes, driving them to ever greater acts of violence in desperate attempts to appease their deity's wrath. Yet on Korthak Prime, the focus of that divine anger stood his ground, anchored by memories of a woman who had died over a century ago, but whose love still had the power to defy gods. Kargoth and his surviving warriors watched their gene-fathers struggle with a mixture of awe and terror. They had seen Angron face the mightiest enemies the galaxy could offer without showing so much as a moment's hesitation. Yet now he trembled like a mortal man confronting forces beyond his comprehension. The red armor that had been stained with the blood of 1,000 victories began to smoke and crack as energies beyond their understanding tore at its surface. Should we help him?" one of the Marines asked, his voice barely steady. Kargoth's response was immediate and final. "How does one help a Primarch fight a god?" The question hung in the air without answer, for indeed, what aid could mortals offer in a struggle that took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously? They could only watch as their father fought for his soul against forces that had shaped his existence for longer than any of them had been alive. Yet in that watching, something unexpected began to happen. The sight of Angron's vulnerability, his willingness to risk everything for the sake of memories that brought him only pain, touched something in the hardened hearts of his sons. These were warriors who had spent decades believing that strength came only through rage, that mercy was weakness, and compassion a fatal flaw. Now they saw their Gene father choosing love over power, memory over might, and in that choice they glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of strength entirely. The battle for Angron's soul raged on, neither side willing to concede defeat, while across the galaxy the consequences of their struggle continued to spread like ripples across the surface of a disturbed pond. Yet in the center of that storm, anchored by the memory of a woman's voice and the dream of freedom she had helped him nurture, a demon prince began to remember what it meant to be human. The memories flooded back with such force that Angron's demon form shuddered under their weight, each recollection striking like a physical blow against the barriers that Khorne's influence had erected around his consciousness. Yet even as the blood god's fury pressed down upon him like the weight of a collapsing star, the artifact's power held firm, pulling him deeper into the past until the present moment became little more than a distant echo. He stood once again in the planning chambers beneath the arena of Deshea, where the greatest rebellion in Nucerian history had been born not from rage, but from hope. The chamber had been carved from living rock generations before, its walls bearing the scars of chisel and pick wielded by countless hands. Crude oil lamps provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows across the faces of 24 gladiators who had proven themselves worthy of trust through blood and shared suffering. Yet among all the assembled warriors, only 2 voices carried the weight of true authority: his own, raw with the fury that would one day consume worlds, and Thyra's, measured and clear as mountain spring water. "The High Riders think in patterns," she was saying, her finger tracing routes across a map that had been drawn in charcoal on the chamber's central table. "They move their forces like pieces in a regicide game, always assuming their opponents will follow predictable strategies. But we are not their game pieces. We are something they have never faced before, slaves who think like generals." Angronius watched her as she spoke, marveling at the transformation that freedom had wrought in the woman who had once been just another brutalized gladiator in the pits above. The strategic mind that their masters had never suspected was now fully unleashed, analyzing the weaknesses of a system she had observed from within for over a decade. Her insights cut through the complexities of Nucerian politics like a blade through silk, revealing vulnerabilities that even the most experienced High Rider would never have imagined. "The garrison at Locaire is their weakest point," she continued, marking positions with careful precision. "They rely on automation for most of their defenses, but the control systems are centralized in the governor's palace. Take that, and we control not just the city's weapons, but its communications grid as well. Cut them off from reinforcements while we liberate the fighting pits, and we double our numbers overnight." The plan was audacious in its scope, requiring coordination across multiple theaters of operation and perfect timing to prevent the High Riders from mounting an effective response. Yet as Thyra laid out the details, Angronius found himself believing not just in the possibility of victory, but in something far more dangerous, the dream of a future where neither of them would ever have to kill for the entertainment of others again. "And after Locaia?" asked Brom, a grizzled veteran whose scars told the story of 30 years in the arenas. "The High Riders won't take this lying down. They'll call in reinforcements from the other cities, maybe even orbital support." Thyra's smile carried the cold edge of someone who had anticipated exactly this question. "Let them come. By the time they realize the scope of what we've accomplished, we'll have turned their own weapons against them. Every liberation expands our capabilities, and every victory brings more slaves to our banner. The High Riders built a system designed to produce perfect warriors. They just never imagined those warriors might fight for themselves instead of their master's amusement." The rebellion, when it finally began, exceeded even Thyra's most optimistic projections. The assault on Locaia came at dawn, when the city's defenders were caught between the changing of the guard shifts and the false security that generations of unchallenged rule had bred in their bones. Angronius led the direct assault on the palace walls, his Primarch strength allowing him to carve through defensive positions that would have stopped any normal force. Behind him, his gladiator brothers moved with the disciplined fury of warriors who had learned their craft in the crucible of life-and-death combat, every movement honed by years of fighting for survival. Yet it was Thyra's tactical brilliance that transformed what should have been a desperate assault into a masterpiece of strategic coordination. While Angronius drew the defenders' attention with his frontal attack, smaller teams struck simultaneously at the city's communication hubs, power stations, and automated defense networks. By the time the High Riders realized they were under coordinated assault rather than random uprising, their ability to respond effectively had been systematically dismantled. The governor's palace fell within hours, its ornate halls echoing with the sound of chains being broken and slaves being freed. Angronius found Thyra in the central command chamber, her fingers dancing across control surfaces that had once been used to coordinate the oppression of millions. Now those same systems served liberation, sending signals to hidden cells across the continent and coordinating the simultaneous uprising that would spread their rebellion like wildfire. "How many?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. 43 cities have responded to our call," she replied, her voice tight with exhaustion and exhilaration in equal measure. "The High Riders' own communication network is carrying the signal that will destroy them. Every gladiator pit, every slave quarter, every forced labor camp, they're all rising at once." The moment should have been one of pure triumph, yet something in Thyra's expression held shadows that spoke of costs yet to be paid. She had always possessed the ability to see further than the immediate victory, to calculate not just what they could achieve, but what they might lose in the achieving. Now, as reports flooded in from across Nuceria, Angronius began to understand the weight that leadership placed upon those wise enough to bear it. "This is only the beginning," Thyra continued, her gaze moving from the tactical displays to the man who had become so much more than her fellow gladiator. "The High Riders will not surrender their power without extracting a price in blood. They'll retreat to their orbital platforms and rain death upon every city that has declared for us. Millions will die before this is over. Then we make sure their sacrifice means something," Angronius replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had made him a leader among the arena's deadliest fighters. "We don't just win this war. We win it so completely that no High Rider will ever again think they can treat human beings like property." What followed were months of warfare that pushed both of them to limits they had never imagined. Thyra's strategic genius proved itself again and again as she outmaneuvered opponents who commanded superior technology and numerical advantages, turning their own strengths against them through a combination of tactical innovation and intimate knowledge of Nucerian psychology. Angronius became the living symbol of their cause, his presence on any battlefield enough to inspire their forces to impossible feats of courage while striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. Yet it was in the quiet moments between battles that something deeper developed between them. Not the desperate passion of warriors facing death, but the steady growth of trust and understanding that comes from two souls perfectly matched in purpose and temperament. They complemented each other in ways that went beyond mere military cooperation, her strategic mind providing the framework for victories that his tactical brilliance could execute with devastating effectiveness. Their greatest triumph came at the Battle of the Crystal Spires, where the High Riders made their final desperate attempt to crush the rebellion through overwhelming force. The enemy had assembled a coalition that included not just Nucerian forces, but mercenary companies from across the sector, confident that their technological superiority and orbital bombardment capabilities would allow them to break the rebellion's back. It should have been a massacre that ended their dreams of freedom in a storm of fire and blood. Instead, it became the moment when Thyra's tactical genius reached its absolute pinnacle. She had spent weeks preparing the battlefield, using her knowledge of Nucerian geology to create a trap that turned the High Riders' advantages into fatal liabilities. When their forces descended from orbit, they found themselves fighting not in the open plains they had expected, but in a carefully prepared killing ground where their superior technology became a hindrance rather than an asset. Angronius led the counterattack when the moment was perfect, his gladiator brothers striking with such coordinated fury that the enemy formation shattered like glass under a hammer blow. Yet even as he carved through the High Riders' elite forces, part of his attention remained fixed on the command position where Thyra orchestrated the battle's broader movements. Watching her work was like witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare, one that valued intelligence over brute force and adaptation over rigid doctrine. The victory was so complete that it broke the High Riders' will to continue the fight. Within days, delegation after delegation arrived seeking terms for surrender, their proud demeanor replaced by the desperate pragmatism of those who had finally understood that their world had changed forever. The rebellion that had begun in the depths of a gladiator pit had become a revolution that would remake Nucerian society from the ground up. It was in the aftermath of that triumph, as they stood together on the walls of the governor's palace and watched the sun set over a world that was finally free, that Angronius first understood what he felt for the woman who had made it all possible. Not gratitude, though that was part of it. Not admiration, though that too was present in abundance. What flowed between them was something both simpler and more complex, a recognition that they had found in each other the one person in all the galaxy who could understand the weight they carried and the dreams they shared. "What happens now?" he asked, though part of him feared that speaking the question might somehow break the spell that held their perfect moment in place. Thyra's response carried the measured confidence that had guided their rebellion from its earliest days. "Now we build something better. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who will come after us. We prove that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of hope." Yet even as she spoke those words, forces were already moving that would make them hollow mockery. High above Nuceria's atmosphere, detection arrays were registering the approach of ships bearing Imperial insignia, their holds filled with space marines, and their commanders carrying orders that would transform triumph into tragedy. The Emperor of mankind had come to claim his son, and in that claiming, the dream that Thyra and Angronius had built together would be destroyed as surely as if it had never existed at all. But in this moment, suspended between victory and loss, they stood together under alien stars and dared to believe that love and hope might be stronger than the galaxy's inexorable hunger for war. It was a belief that would prove tragically naive, yet the memory of it blazed with such intensity that even the combined fury of the blood god could not entirely extinguish its light. The echo of that moment reached across the decades to where Angron knelt in the ashes of his own sons, and for the first time in over a century, The demon prince wept not from rage or pain, but from the simple, devastating recognition of what he had lost when he chose power over love. The memory that came next struck Angron with such devastating clarity that his demon form convulsed, wings folding inward as if to shield him from the truth he had spent over a century trying to forget. Yet there was no escaping what the artifact had unlocked, no returning to the comfortable darkness of suppressed recollection. The moment that had defined his hatred for the Emperor, and his hatred for himself, blazed before him with the intensity of a dying star, forcing him to confront not just what had happened, but what it truly meant. The sky above Nuceria had been the color of old blood when the Imperial ships arrived, their hulls gleaming like golden daggers against the crimson backdrop of the world's twin suns. The final battle of the rebellion was already raging across the plains before Nuceria, where the last coalition of High Rider forces had made their desperate stand against the tide of liberation that threatened to sweep away their ancient privileges forever. Angronius fought at the center of the storm, his weapons singing their deadly song as he carved through enemy formations with the unstoppable fury of righteous anger given form. Yet even in the midst of combat, part of his attention remained fixed on the tactical situation unfolding around them. Thyra's final strategy was reaching its culmination, the carefully orchestrated movements of their forces closing like the jaws of a trap around the High Riders' remaining strongholds. Victory was no longer a question, only the scope of their triumph and the cost it would exact from both sides. They stood perhaps hours away from the complete liberation of their homeworld, from the fulfillment of every dream they had dared to nurture in the darkness of their shared captivity. It was in that moment of approaching triumph that the golden figure descended from the heavens, like a god of ancient myth made manifest. The Emperor of mankind came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet inevitability of a force of nature reshaping the landscape to suit its purposes. His presence struck the battlefield like a physical blow, causing friend and foe alike to pause in their struggles as they felt the weight of something vast and incomprehensible settling over them. The first time Angronius had experienced this memory, filtered through the rage-inducing torment of the butcher's nails, he had perceived only the surface details: the Emperor's arrival, his own teleportation, the helpless fury that had consumed him as he watched his people die from the safety of an Imperial ship. Now, with his mind cleared of the nail's constant interference, he could see layers of meaning that had been hidden from him for over a century. The Emperor's approach was not the random intervention he had believed it to be. Every step, every gesture, every word spoke of careful calculation and long-term planning. This was not a rescue, but a harvesting. The master of mankind had come to claim an asset, and everything else, the rebellion, the High Riders, the countless slaves who had fought and died for freedom, was merely collateral damage in the equation too vast for mortal comprehension. "My lord," Thyra's voice cut through the chaos of battle as she fought her way to his position, her weapons moving with the deadly precision of someone who had learned their craft in the crucible of life and death combat. Yet beneath her combat effectiveness, Angronius could see the fear that she tried so hard to hide. Not fear of death, for that was an old companion that neither of them had any reason to dread, but fear of something far worse. "The Golden Warrior approaches. Our scouts report Imperial forces moving to surround the battlefield." The Emperor came to them across the blood-soaked plain with measured steps, his ornate armor unmarked by the violence that surrounded him, his expression carrying the distant serenity of one who observed mortal struggles from a perspective so elevated that individual lives became mere statistics. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Yet beneath its perfect tones, Angronius now detected something that his younger self had been too inexperienced to recognize: the cold efficiency of a being who had made peace with necessary evil long ago. "Angronius of Nuceria," the Emperor said, his golden gaze fixing upon the young primarch with laser-like intensity. You are my son, created from my own genetic template to serve in the great crusade that will unite humanity among the stars. Your destiny lies not in the petty struggles of this backward world, but in the conquest of the galaxy itself." The words should have been a revelation, an explanation for the strange dreams and impossible strength that had always set him apart from his fellow slaves. Instead, they struck Angronius like a blow to the chest, carrying with them implications that made his blood run cold. If this being spoke truth, then everything he had believed about himself was a lie. He was not a slave who had risen to lead his people to freedom. He was a weapon that had temporarily forgotten its purpose. "Then help us," Angronius replied, his voice tight with desperate hope. "You claim I am your son. Prove it by saving my people. Your ships can break the High Rider's orbital platforms. Your warriors can ensure our victory is complete. We stand on the threshold of liberation. All we need is the power to take that final step." The silence that followed his plea stretched like a blade drawn across taut nerves. Around them, the battle continued to rage, but it seemed distant now, as if the weight of the conversation between God and Primarch had somehow isolated them from the mundane concerns of mortal warfare. When the Emperor finally responded, his words carried the inexorable finality of a judge pronouncing sentence upon the guilty. "Your people are not my concern," he said, each syllable falling like a hammer blow upon Angronius's hopes. "They are a evolutionary dead end, a population of slaves who have proven incapable of transcending their circumstances without external intervention. You, however, possess the genetic heritage necessary to serve the Imperium's greater purpose. That is the only calculation that matters." The casual dismissal of millions of lives struck Angronius with greater force than any weapon he had ever faced. This being who claimed to be his father was willing to condemn an entire world to continued slavery simply because their liberation didn't serve his broader purposes. The rebellion that Thyra had planned so carefully, the freedom they had fought and died to achieve, none of it mattered to the golden figure who offered power in exchange for abandoning everything that gave that power meaning. "No." The word escaped Angronius's lips before conscious thought could stop it. "I will not abandon them. If you are truly my father, then you know what honor means. These people trusted me to lead them to freedom. I will not betray that trust for any promise of power." Yet even as he spoke the words, Angronius could feel forces beyond his comprehension moving to override his choice. The Emperor's power reached out with irresistible force, not to persuade or convince, but simply to claim what he considered his property. The teleportation began as a subtle disorientation, reality becoming fluid around the young Primarch as Imperial technology prepared to tear him away from everything he had ever known or loved. "Angronius!" Thyra's cry cut through the growing distortion like a blade through silk, her voice carrying all the desperate urgency of someone who understood that this moment would define everything that followed. She fought her way through the chaos of battle with single-minded determination, her weapons clearing a path through friend and foe alike as she struggled to reach his side before the golden light could claim him entirely. She arrived just as the teleportation field reached its peak intensity, her hands grasping for his, even as the space between them began to bend and warp. For one impossible moment, their fingers touched across the dimensional boundary that separated them, and in that contact, entire conversations passed without words. Love, regret, promises that could never be kept, dreams that would never see fulfillment, all of it compressed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Remember us," Thyra whispered, her voice somehow reaching him across the gulf of tortured space-time that the Emperor's technology had created. "Whatever they make you become, whatever they tell you about duty and destiny, remember that we chose to die free rather than live as slaves. Remember that love is stronger than any chain they can forge." Then the teleportation reached completion, and Angronius found himself standing in the sterile confines of an Imperial transport, watching through viewports as the world he had fought to liberate dwindled to a point of light among the stars. Below, on Nuceria's surface, the rebellion died with him, not because their cause was hopeless, but because their hope had been ripped away at the moment of its greatest triumph. The young Primarch pressed his palms against the transparent aluminum of the viewport, his enhanced vision tracking the orbital bombardment that began almost immediately after his departure. The High Riders, emboldened by the disappearance of their greatest enemy, called down fire from the heavens upon the slave armies that had dared to dream of freedom. City after city vanished in nuclear fire until the red sands of Nuceria ran with more than just the blood of gladiators. Yet it was not the destruction that broke Angronius's spirit. It was the understanding that came with it. The Emperor could have prevented the massacre with a single word, could have preserved the lives of every man, woman, and child who had followed their gladiator leaders into battle. He possessed the power to fulfill every promise of liberation that the rebellion had represented. He chose not to, because their lives served no purpose in his grand design for the galaxy. That was the moment when love died in the Primarch's heart, replaced by a rage so pure and focused that it would eventually make him the perfect vessel for Corny's influence. Not rage at the High Riders who had enslaved him, for they were merely following their nature. Not rage at the circumstances that had brought the Emperor to Nuceria at that precise moment, for chance was beyond anyone's control. No, the fury that consumed him was directed at the one being in the galaxy who could have saved them all and chose not to, the one who called himself father while demonstrating that paternity without love was just another form of slavery. Now, kneeling among the corpses of his own sons on a world whose name he barely knew, Angron felt that ancient rage return with renewed force. Yet this time it was tempered by understanding that the butcher's nails had never allowed him to achieve. The Emperor's betrayal had been monstrous, yes, but Angronius had chosen to remain aboard that ship. He had chosen to accept the power that came with abandoning his people. He had chosen to become the monster that his father's pragmatism required, rather than dying with the only family that had ever truly mattered to him. Thyra had been right about so many things, but she had been wrong about one crucial detail. Love was not stronger than any chain, but perhaps, if he could find the courage that had failed him once before, it might be strong enough to break the ones that mattered most. The artifact pulsed in Angron's massive palm like a captured star, its ancient mechanisms responding to the demon Primarch's desperate need with energies that predated the fall of human civilization. As the weight of recovered memory settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead, he began to understand what the device truly was. Not merely a relic of lost technology, but a key that could unlock chains he had worn for so long that he had forgotten they could be removed. The butcher's nails, those cybernetic tormentors that had shaped his existence for over a century, suddenly seemed not like integral parts of his being, but like parasites that had fed upon his soul until nothing remained but hollow rage. With trembling fingers that could crush ceramite as easily as paper, Angron brought the artifact closer to his skull, seeking the neural interface points where the nails had been hammered into his brain tissue decades ago. The device responded with increasing intensity, its geometric patterns shifting faster as it detected the proximity of the technology it had been designed to counteract. Pain shot through his consciousness, not the familiar agony of the nail's constant stimulation, but something entirely different. This was the pain of healing, of neural pathways long suppressed, struggling to reconnect, of a mind learning to function without the artificial fury that had sustained it for so long. Yet even as hope flickered to life in the depths of his transfigured soul, the universe itself seemed to recoil from the possibility of his redemption. The sky above Korthak Prime began to darken with unnatural clouds, their roiling masses shot through with veins of crimson lightning that spoke of the blood god's mounting fury. Khorne's rage was no longer confined to the immaterial realm of the warp. It was bleeding through into reality itself, manifesting as a storm that turned the very air into something thick and oppressive. The temperature dropped by degrees that should have been impossible on a world so close to its primary star, yet the cold that settled over the battlefield carried no natural chill. This was the frigid touch of divine wrath, the absolute zero of a being whose anger burned so hot that it had cycled back around to something that froze the soul rather than consuming it. Where the crimson lightning struck the ground, the soil turned to glass that reflected scenes of violence from across the galaxy. Worlds burning, armies clashing, individuals murdering each other with gleeful abandon. From the ruins of the Hive City, the surviving World Eaters felt the change like a physical blow to their enhanced physiology. Captain Khan led the largest group as they made their way across the devastated landscape, their red armor gleaming dully in the unnatural twilight that had descended over their position. Behind him marched veterans of campaigns that had lasted decades, warriors who had followed their Primarch through the fires of rebellion and transformation without ever questioning the path that led them deeper into damnation. Yet now, for the first time in any of their memories, doubt crept into their hearts like poison, seeping through armor joints. The psychic bond that connected them to their gene father had always carried a constant undercurrent of rage, a connection to the fury that defined their legion's identity and purpose. Now that connection transmitted something far more disturbing: uncertainty, regret, and emotions that had no place in the mental architecture of Khorne's chosen warriors. "Lord Angron," Khan called, as his force crested a ridge that brought them within sight of the demon Primarch's position. What he saw there stopped him cold, his enhanced vision processing details that his enhanced mind struggled to accept. Their gene-father knelt among the corpses of his own sons, holding some form of archaeotech device against his skull, while reality itself seemed to warp around him in response to supernatural forces beyond mortal comprehension. Angron looked up at the sound of his name, and Khan felt his twin hearts skip beats as he gazed into eyes that seemed almost human for the first time in living memory. The burning coals that had defined the Red Angel's gaze since his transformation into a demon prince were still present, yet they flickered now with something that might have been recognition, regret, or even love. It was a sight more terrifying to the veteran captain than any battlefield he had ever walked. "My sons," Angron said, his voice carrying none of its usual thunder, but all the more compelling for its quiet intensity. "Forgive me. I have remembered what I chose to forget, and in that remembering, I have seen what we have all become." The words struck the assembled World Eaters like physical blows, carrying implications that challenged everything they thought they knew about their purpose and identity. They were warriors of Khorne, champions of the blood god who had transcended the weaknesses of mere mortality through dedication to pure violence. Yet their gene-father spoke of choice and memory, as if these concepts held more weight than the certainty of endless war. Sergeant Kargoth, who had witnessed the beginning of his Primarch's transformation, stepped forward with the careful precision of a man walking across a minefield. "My lord, the Legion awaits your commands. The campaign requires coordination, and the enemy is not who we thought it was," Angron interrupted, his massive form rising to its full height as the artifact continued to pulse in his grasp. "The enemy is not the Imperium, not the Loyalist legions, not even the Xenos races that infest the galaxy. The enemy is what we have become. Slaves to gods who care nothing for our souls, only for the sustenance our violence provides them." The blasphemy of those words hit the World Eaters like a psychic shockwave, causing several of the younger Marines to stagger as their conditioning warred with their gene-father's pronouncements. They had been raised to believe that service to Khorne was the highest form of existence possible, that the blood god's gifts elevated them above the mundane concerns of baseline humanity. Now their primarch spoke of that service as slavery, casting doubt on the fundamental assumptions that had governed their existence for decades. Yet even as Angron spoke, he could feel the artifact's power beginning to change him in ways that went beyond the simple suppression of the butcher's nails. The device was not merely shutting down the cybernetic implants, it was somehow reversing the neurochemical changes they had wrought, restoring neural pathways that had been cauterized by decades of artificial rage. For the first time since his youth on Nuceria, Angron felt capable of emotions other than fury. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Love, hope, regret, compassion, feelings he had not experienced since before the Emperor's arrival, flooded through his consciousness like water breaking through a dam. Yet with them came a clarity of thought that allowed him to see his situation with devastating accuracy. He was a demon prince of chaos, sustained by energies drawn from the warp itself. If he severed his connection to Khorne, he would be gambling not just his power, but his very existence on the possibility that his original physiology could sustain him without supernatural enhancement. More than that, he would be abandoning the World Eaters at a time when they needed leadership most. The Horus Heresy was reaching its climax, and his legion played a crucial role in the War Master's plans for the assault on Terra itself. If he walked away from that responsibility, how many of his sons would die in the chaos that followed? How many more worlds would burn because he had chosen personal redemption over strategic necessity? The moral weight of that choice pressed down upon him with crushing force, yet somehow the burden felt lighter than the rage he had carried for so long. This was clean pain, honest suffering that served a purpose beyond the endless feeding of a hungry god. For the first time in over a century, Angron felt like he was making a choice that belonged entirely to him, rather than following the dictates of powers that had never truly cared about his well-being. "I could end this," he said, speaking more to himself than to the assembled Marines who watched with growing concern. "I could sever the chains that bind me to the blood god and seek redemption. But the cost—" He looked down at Kargoth, at Kharn, at all the warriors who had followed him through the darkest paths the galaxy had to offer. "The cost would be leaving you without guidance in the wars to come. You would be leaderless in a universe that offers no mercy to the weak." Captain Kharn stepped forward, his scarred features set in grim determination. "My lord, we are world eaters. We have never needed mercy from the universe. We have taken what we required through strength of arms. If you believe this path leads to something better than what we have become, then we will follow you down it, whatever the cost." The simple declaration of loyalty struck Angron with greater force than any enemy weapon ever had. These warriors, these sons he had led into damnation through his own choices, were willing to trust him even as he questioned everything that had defined their shared existence. They offered their faith not because they understood where his new path might lead, but because they believed he was worthy of that trust. Yet even as their words kindled something like hope in his chest, the storm overhead intensified in response to Khorne's mounting fury. The blood god's rage was beginning to manifest more directly, reality itself becoming increasingly unstable as the patron deity of violence focused his attention on the world where his greatest champion contemplated defection. Lightning struck the ground around them with increasing frequency, each bolt carrying the psychic signature of divine wrath that made even the enhanced nervous systems of space marines recoil in sympathetic agony. Angron closed his eyes and felt the weight of decision settling upon him like a crown of thorns. The artifact offered freedom from the chains that had bound him for so long, yet that freedom would come at a price that might destroy everything he had ever cared about. The choice before him was not simply between redemption and damnation. It was between the certainty of familiar suffering and the terrifying possibility of something better. When he opened his eyes again, they blazed not with the artificial fury of Khorne's influence, but with the terrible clarity of a soul that had finally chosen to reclaim itself from the powers that had sought to define its fate. The demon prince of the World Eaters raised the artifact to his skull once more, feeling its ancient mechanisms reaching out to interface with technology that should have been beyond its ability to affect. "Then let us see," Angron said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment, "if love truly is stronger than any chain they can forge." The artifact's power coursed through Angron's consciousness like fire through dry timber, burning away the accumulated scar tissue that decades of artificial rage had built around his capacity for genuine emotion. Yet with that purification came a clarity of perception that struck him like a physical blow, forcing him to truly see the carnage that surrounded him for the first time since the massacre had begun. The corpses of his own sons lay scattered across the alien soil, in attitudes that spoke of confusion and betrayal as much as violent death, their red armor stained with blood that had flowed from wounds inflicted by their own gene-father's hand. With movements that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, Angron began to walk among the fallen, his massive form casting shifting shadows across faces that had once looked upon him with unwavering loyalty. The demon Primarch's enhanced senses, no longer clouded by the butcher's nail's constant interference, began to process details that his rage-addled mind had overlooked during the killing. These were not faceless enemies who had died in glorious combat, but individuals who possessed names, histories, and bonds of kinship that stretched back decades. Brother Sergeant Vorthak lay crumpled against the twisted remains of what had once been a rhino transport, his helmet split open to reveal features that Angron now remembered with devastating clarity. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw had been earned during the compliance of Golst 7, where he had thrown himself between his Primarch and an enemy sniper's bullet. The bronze service studs that decorated his brow spoke of campaigns fought across half the galaxy, each one representing a world brought into Imperial compliance through blood and determination. Vorthak had been among the first of the warhounds to undergo the implantation of the butcher's nails, volunteering for the procedure not because he craved violence, but because he sought to understand the torment that afflicted his gene-father. "If you must bear this burden, my lord," he had said on the day before the surgery, "then let me share it with you. No son should watch his father suffer alone." Now he would never suffer anything again, his loyalty repaid with a chain-axe blow that had cleaved through his skull like parchment. Near him lay Tekmarine Kolb, his red armor decorated with the cogwheel sigils of the Mechanicus and the accumulated wisdom of 3 centuries spent maintaining the Legion's wargear. Angron could remember the night cycles they had spent together in the depths of the flagship's armory, the ancient warrior sharing stories of the worlds he had seen before the Emperor's great crusade, while his servo-skulls worked to repair damage from the latest campaign. Kolb had possessed one of the few minds in the Legion capable of finding peace despite the nail's constant torment, his technical precision serving as an anchor against the storm of artificial fury that consumed so many of his brothers. The realization that these were not abstract casualties, but individuals whose lives he had personally destroyed, struck Angron with such force that his demon form shuddered, wings folding inward as if to shield him from the weight of his own guilt. Each corpse represented not just a death, but the extinguishing of decades' worth of loyalty, brotherhood, and shared purpose. These warriors had followed him across the galaxy, had trusted him to lead them toward something greater than mere survival, and he had murdered them in a moment of blind rage that had served no purpose beyond feeding the endless hunger of a god who cared nothing for their individual worth. Brother Captain Draeger had fallen near the center of the killing field, his power sword still clutched in hands that would never again know the weight of a weapon. He had been one of the Legion's finest duelists, his blade work combining the technical precision of Terran military doctrine with innovations learned from a dozen different warrior cultures. More than that, he had been a storyteller whose tales could hold an entire company spellbound during the long watches between battles, weaving narratives that helped his brothers remember what they fought to preserve, even as the nails sought to reduce them to mindless killing machines. The memory of Dreger's voice rose unbidden from the depths of Angron's consciousness, carrying words spoken during the dark days following their transformation into servants of Khorne. "The stories matter, my lord," the captain had said, his scarred features set in grim determination. "Whatever else the nails take from us, we must not let them steal our capacity to remember why we chose this path. We are not monsters. We are warriors who have sacrificed our peace for the promise of something greater." Yet what greater purpose had been served by his death? What noble cause had been advanced by the slaughter of dozens of loyal space marines who had committed no crime beyond trusting their Gene Father's judgment? Angron knelt beside Dreger's corpse, his claws hovering above the captain's still features as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. This was not collateral damage in some grander strategic gambit, not the unfortunate but necessary cost of achieving crucial objectives. This was simple, meaningless murder committed by a creature who had forgotten the difference between strength and savagery. The surviving World Eaters watched their Primarch's strange behavior with growing unease, their enhanced senses detecting emotional resonances that had no place in the mental architecture of Khorne's chosen warriors. Captain Khan approached with the careful precision of a predator testing uncertain ground, his hand resting on the hilt of his chain axe, not from any intent to threaten, but from simple, instinctive readiness for violence. "My lord," Khan said carefully, his voice carrying the controlled modulation of someone trying not to provoke an unstable situation. "These deaths serve the blood god's purpose. Our fallen brothers have earned their place in Khorne's hall through glorious combat. There is no dishonor in their passing." The platitudes that might once have provided comfort now struck Angron like physical blows, each word highlighting the vast gulf that separated his current perspective from the worldview that had sustained him through decades of increasingly meaningless violence. Glory? What glory was there in being murdered by one's own father figure in a fit of uncontrolled rage? Honor? What honor existed in dying, confused and betrayed while trying to serve a cause that had long since lost any connection to rational purpose? "No," Angron said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "There is no glory here, no honor, only waste. Only the senseless destruction of lives that should have been spent in service to something worthy of their sacrifice." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the assembled warriors. These were concepts that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about their purpose and identity. They were World Eaters, champions of the blood god who had transcended the weaknesses of mere mortality through dedication to pure violence. Yet their Gene Father spoke of waste and senselessness as if these concepts held more weight than the certainty of eternal war. Sergeant Kargoth stepped forward, his weathered features creased with concern. "My lord, perhaps the strain of recent battles has affected your judgment. The enemy—" "I am the enemy!" Angron's voice thundered across the battlefield with such force that several of the younger Marines staggered backward, their enhanced nervous systems recoiling from the psychic pressure of their Primarch's anguish. Not the Imperium, not the Loyalist legions, not any external force that we might face in honest combat. I am the enemy of everything these warriors lived and died to protect. I have become the very thing they swore to oppose when they first took their oaths of service." The demon Primarch's form began to blaze with conflicting energies as his declaration echoed across dimensions, reaching the ears of powers that had no tolerance for such blasphemy. In the deepest reaches of the warp, Khorne's attention focused with laser-like intensity on the world where his greatest champion had chosen defiance over service. The blood god's rage was no longer merely cosmic background radiation. It was becoming a focused beam of divine fury that threatened to burn away everything that stood in its path. Yet even as supernatural forces gathered to reclaim their wayward servant, Angron felt something stirring in the depths of his consciousness that had nothing to do with demonic power or artificial enhancement. It was the simple, human capacity for choice, the ability to decide between competing courses of action based on moral principle rather than expedience or external compulsion. For the first time in over a century, the daemon primarch felt like he was acting according to his own will rather than following the dictates of powers that cared nothing for his individual autonomy. "I remember who I was before the galaxy broke me," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelation and regret in equal measure. "I remember what I believed in, what I was willing to die for, and what I chose to abandon when survival seemed more important than principle. These warriors deserved better than to die by the hand of someone who had forgotten the difference between strength and cruelty." The artifact pulsed against his palm with increasing intensity, its ancient mechanisms responding to his emotional state by amplifying the neural changes that were already reshaping his consciousness. The butcher's nails, those cybernetic tormentors that had defined his existence for so long, began to shut down completely as the device's power overrode their base programming. For the first time since their installation, Angron's mind was entirely his own. Free from artificial stimulation, free from external manipulation, free to choose its own path regardless of what others might demand. "The blood god offered me power," Angron said, rising to his full height as the storm overhead intensified in response to his words. "He promised that rage would make me strong, that violence would give meaning to existence, that endless war would somehow justify the price we paid to wage it. But I see now what that promise truly was. Not elevation, but enslavement. Not strength, but weakness disguised as virtue." The assembled world eaters exchanged uncertain glances, their conditioning warring with their gene father's pronouncements in ways that left them emotionally adrift. They had spent decades believing that service to Khorne was the highest form of existence possible, that the blood god's gifts elevated them above the mundane concerns of baseline humanity. Now their primarch spoke of that service as slavery, casting doubt on the fundamental assumptions that had governed their existence. Yet beneath the confusion and uncertainty, something else began to stir. The same capacity for moral choice that had originally drawn them to serve under Angron's banner during the Great Crusade. They had not become Space Marines because they craved violence, but because they believed in the promise of a better galaxy that could be achieved through disciplined application of righteous force. That promise had been corrupted over the decades, twisted into something unrecognizable. But perhaps it was not entirely beyond redemption. "What would you have us do, my lord?" Khan asked, his voice stripped of the casual violence that had characterized his speech for so long. "If the path we have walked leads only to damnation, where do we go from here?" Angron looked down at his son, seeing past the scarred features and ritual brands to the warrior who had once fought for something greater than mere survival. "We remember what we swore to protect," he said simply. "We remember that strength without purpose is merely destruction, and we choose to be something better than the monsters we have become." The demon primarch raised the artifact to his skull once more, feeling its power reaching out to complete the work it had begun. The final severance of his connection to Khorne would leave him vulnerable, possibly mortal, certainly diminished from the cosmic force he had been as a servant of chaos. Yet for the first time in over a century, that prospect filled him, not with terror, but with something that might have been called hope. The moment Angron pressed the artifact fully against the neural interface ports of the butcher's nails, reality itself convulsed in agony. The ancient device's power surged through the cybernetic implants like molten gold through ice, its archaeotech mechanisms overriding systems that had been designed to be permanent fixtures of his neurological architecture. The psychic backlash that followed was not merely localized to Korthak Prime, it rippled outward through the immaterial realm of the warp like a shockwave from an exploding star, affecting every sensitive soul within a dozen light-years of its epicenter. Aboard Imperial vessels scattered across the Korthak system, astropaths collapsed in screaming fits as the psychic storm struck their unprotected minds. Their third eyes bled golden light that spoke of forces beyond mortal comprehension, and their death cries echoed through the ship corridors with words in languages that predated human civilization. Navigator houses felt the disturbance as a burning pressure behind their warp site, forcing them to abandon their calculations and retreat to shielded chambers, as their ability to perceive the currents of the Imperium became a liability rather than an asset. On distant worlds where chaos cultists had gathered to perform their dark rituals, the ceremonies collapsed into madness as the participants felt their patron deity's fury transmitted directly into their consciousness. Some tore out their own eyes rather than witness the cosmic tantrum that their god was throwing in response to a single mortal's act of defiance. Others simply died, their mortal frames unable to contain the overflow of divine rage that sought outlets for its expression. Yet it was on Korthak Prime itself that the true scope of Khorne's fury became manifest. The blood god's attention, focused with laser-like intensity on the world where his greatest champion had chosen rebellion over service, began to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The crimson lightning that had illuminated the unnatural storm overhead coalesced into shapes that possessed their own malevolent intelligence, avatars of pure rage given temporary form through the intersection of divine will and malleable space-time. The first manifestation burst from the ground beneath Angron's feet like a geyser of molten brass, its form shifting between humanoid and abstract as it struggled to maintain coherent existence in the material realm. When it finally stabilized, the avatar stood twice the height of a space marine, its skin the color of dried blood and its eyes burning with the same fury that had once driven the demon Primarch to acts of unthinkable violence. In its hands, weapons materialized from condensed wrath, axes that screamed for blood, and swords that wept tears of molten metal. "Return to me, fallen son," the avatar spoke with a voice like grinding stone, each word carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "You are mine by right of conquest, by bonds of service freely given, by oaths sworn in blood upon the altar of eternal war. No mortal artifice can sever what divine will has forged." Angron's response came not in words, but in action, his massive frame rising to meet the avatar's challenge, even as the artifact continued its work of neural reconstruction. The demon Primarch's form flickered between states of being, sometimes the terrifying majesty of Khorne's champion, sometimes something that resembled the mortal warrior he had been before his transformation. The conflict between his essential nature and his artificial enhancement played out across his physiology in ways that defied conventional understanding of how reality functioned. "I was never yours," Angron replied, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of fundamental change occurring at the cellular level. "I was broken, twisted, forced into a shape that served your hunger rather than my own will. What you call service, I name slavery. What you call strength, I know to be weakness disguised as virtue." The battle that followed transcended physical combat, becoming something closer to a philosophical argument conducted through the medium of pure violence. Each blow that Angron struck against the avatar was simultaneously an attack on the concept it represented and a declaration of his own moral autonomy. Each strike that the manifestation landed in return carried with it the accumulated weight of every act of rage he had ever committed in Khorne's name, seeking to remind him of the power that came with surrendering individual choice to cosmic purpose. Around them, the surviving World Eaters found themselves caught in the crossfire of forces that operated according to laws they had never been taught to understand. The psychic pressure generated by the conflict between their gene father and his patron deity began to affect their own conditioning, causing the butcher's nails implanted in their skulls to malfunction in unpredictable ways. Some experienced their first moments of true peace in decades as the artificial stimulation failed, while others found their rage amplified beyond any sustainable level. Captain Khan felt the change like a physical wound, the familiar burning in his skull suddenly replaced by a hollow silence that left him emotionally adrift. Without the nail's constant pressure driving him toward violence, he found himself capable of thoughts and feelings that had been suppressed for so long that experiencing them felt like rediscovering forgotten senses. The warrior who had been one of Khorne's most devoted servants now stood paralyzed by the sudden return of his capacity for doubt, fear, and something that might have been hope. "Brothers," he called out, his voice cracking with emotions he could not name, "what is happening to us? I can think. For the first time in decades, I can actually think without the rage clouding my judgment." Yet not all of the Legion's survivors experienced the same liberation. Sergeant Bloodspitter, his cognomen earned through decades of particularly brutal service to the Blood God, felt his nails surge with increased intensity as Khorne's attention focused on reclaiming his wayward servants. The artificial stimulation reached levels that should have killed him outright, yet instead of death, he experienced a kind of transcendence that transformed him into something more avatar than Matin. "The Blood God calls," Bloodspitter roared, his voice distorting as his larynx restructured itself to better channel divine fury. "Who among you will answer? Who among you remembers the glory of endless war?" The question divided the assembled World Eaters along lines that had nothing to do with rank or seniority, and everything to do with the fundamental nature of their individual souls. Some, like Khan, found themselves drawn to their Gene Father's struggle for autonomy, recognizing in his defiance an echo of the principles that had originally motivated them to take up arms in the Emperor's Great Crusade. Others, like Bloodspitter, cleaved to the certainty that service to Khorne provided, unwilling or unable to contemplate existence without the structure that eternal war imposed upon their lives. The battlefield became a three-way conflict, as loyalties fractured and reformed in real time. World Eaters who had fought as brothers for decades found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological divide that brooked no compromise, their weapons turning toward each other with the same efficient brutality they had once reserved for external enemies. The sight of his sons tearing each other apart added another layer of agony to Angron's already overwhelming burden. Yet he could not spare the attention necessary to intervene. His own survival depended on maintaining absolute focus on the supernatural forces that sought to drag him back into Khorne's service. More avatars began to manifest as the Blood God's fury reached new heights of intensity, each one slightly different from the others, yet all sharing the same core purpose: to reclaim the wayward champion and demonstrate the price of defying cosmic authority. They rose from pools of spilled blood, coalesced from the screams of the dying, and stepped through dimensional rifts that opened like wounds in the fabric of space-time. Soon, Angron found himself facing not one, but dozens of manifestations, each one carrying a portion of his patron deity's infinite rage. Yet even as the avatars multiplied, something fundamental was changing in the demon primarch's essential nature. The artifact's work had progressed beyond the simple suppression of the butcher's nails to something far more profound. It was systematically reversing the spiritual transformation that had made him into a creature of chaos. The warp stuff that comprised much of his current form began to sublimate back into the immaterial realm, leaving behind something that resembled his original Primarch physiology. The process was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, each moment bringing him closer to genuine freedom, while simultaneously stripping away the supernatural enhancements that had made him one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. His wings, those magnificent instruments of flight and intimidation, began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. The hellish radiance that had surrounded him since his transformation dimmed to the point where his features became recognizably human for the first time in over a century. "You grow weak, fallen one of the avatars taunted, its brass sword carving gouges in Angron's rapidly changing form. "Soon you will be nothing more than mortal flesh, prey to any enemy with the will to strike you down. Is this freedom worth such a price?" Angron's response came through gritted teeth as another avatar's axe found its mark, opening wounds that bled not ichor, but recognizably human blood. "Yes," he gasped, the simple affirmation carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, yes. To die free is infinitely preferable to living as a slave, no matter how powerful that slavery might make me. The declaration struck the assembled avatars like a physical blow, causing several to stagger backward, as if the concept of willing sacrifice for principle was somehow toxic to their essential nature. Yet their hesitation lasted only moments before divine fury reasserted itself, driving them forward with renewed violence born of desperation. If they could not reclaim Khorne's champion through temptation or intimidation, they would do so through the simple expedient of destroying his mortal form and forcing his soul back into the warp where it belonged. As the battle reached its crescendo, with avatars pressing their attack from all directions, while world eaters fought and died around the perimeter of the supernatural conflict, Angron felt something stirring in the depths of his consciousness that had nothing to do with rage or divine power. It was the quiet strength that had sustained him through the darkest days of his enslavement on Nuceria, the love for his gladiator family that had made rebellion seem preferable to survival, and the hope that somewhere in the galaxy, redemption might still be possible for those willing to pay its price. That hope, fragile as spun glass, yet harder than adamantium, became his anchor against the storm of cosmic fury that sought to tear his soul apart. Whatever happened next, whether he lived or died, succeeded or failed, he would face it as himself rather than as the creature that others had made him. For the first time in over a century, Angron was truly free, and that freedom, however brief it might prove to be, was worth any sacrifice that the universe might demand. The artifact's power began to falter, just as Angron needed it most, its ancient mechanisms overheating from the strain of channeling forces that even its pre-Dark Age designers had never imagined possible. Wisps of smoke rose from the geometric patterns etched into its surface, and the harmonious hum that had accompanied its operation devolved into the erratic sputtering of a machine pushed beyond its operational limits. The neural cascade that had been systematically dismantling the butcher's nails slowed to a crawl, leaving Angron trapped between states of being, no longer fully demon, but not yet truly free. The avatars of Khorne sensed the device's weakness, like predators scenting blood in the water, their brass weapons gleaming with anticipation as they pressed their attack with renewed fury. The largest of the manifestations, its form wreathed in flames that burned without consuming, raised a sword the length of a battle tank above its head and brought it down in an arc that would have cleaved a titan in half. Angron barely managed to interpose Gorechild between the blade and his skull, the impact sending shock waves through his deteriorating physiology that left him staggered and gasping. "The mortal toy fails you, as all mortal constructs must," the avatar intoned, its voice carrying the weight of cosmic inevitability. "You cannot fight the nature of what you are, cannot deny the bonds that bind your soul to eternal service. Return willingly, and perhaps the blood god will show mercy for this moment of weakness. Resist further, and experience torments that will make your current suffering seem like gentle caresses." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Angron felt his resolve wavering under the combined assault of physical pain, supernatural pressure, and the growing certainty that his rebellion had been doomed from the start. The artifact grew hot in his palm, its failing mechanisms no longer able to maintain the delicate neural reconstruction that was his only hope of true freedom. Around him, the battle between his divided suns continued to rage, their fraternal bonds sundered by the impossible choice between loyalty to their gene father and service to the god who had shaped their very existence. The Daemon Primarch's strength was failing, his partially transformed physiology caught between two incompatible states in ways that left him vulnerable to attacks that should not have posed any threat to a being of his power. Blood flowed from dozens of wounds that refused to heal, each one representing a failure of the supernatural resilience that had sustained him through countless battles. His vision began to blur as exhaustion and trauma took their toll, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Angron confronted the very real possibility that he might not survive to see its conclusion. It was in that moment of deepest despair, when hope seemed as distant as the stars themselves, that the final memory came to him, with a clarity that burned away every other consideration. Not a fragment or glimpse this time, but a complete recollection, so vivid that it felt more real than the battle raging around him. He stood once again in the depths of the gladiator quarters beneath the arena of Deshea, but this time the scene was different, quieter, more intimate, charged with the kind of significance that only comes with the benefit of hindsight. Thyra sat on the edge of her sleeping pallet, her scarred hands working to repair a damaged piece of training armor, while she spoke in the low, measured tones she used when imparting something she considered genuinely important. This was not the tactical brilliance she displayed during their rebellion planning, nor the fierce defiance she showed in the arena, but something gentler and infinitely more precious, the wisdom of someone who had found peace despite circumstances that should have destroyed any capacity for hope. "Do you know what I learned in the mountains before they brought me here?" she was saying, her voice carrying the soft accent of her Highland tribe. "My grandmother used to tell stories about warriors who became so consumed by their battles that they forgot what they were fighting to protect. They would win every engagement, crush every enemy, yet somehow lose everything that mattered in the process. Young Angronius, still unmarked by the butcher's nails and innocent of the cosmic forces that would one day claim him, listened with the rapt attention he reserved for her words alone. What happened to them? Some died in their armor, surrounded by the corpses of their enemies, but with nothing left inside themselves worth preserving," Thyra replied, her needlework continuing with practiced ease. "Others learned to lay down their weapons when the fighting was done, to remember that strength without compassion is just another form of weakness. The choice was always theirs to make, no matter how far they had fallen or how much blood they had spilled." She looked up from her work then, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to the core of his being. "Promise me something, Angronius. Whatever happens to us, whatever this galaxy demands of you, remember that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. Even the most broken soul can find peace if they're willing to surrender the pride that keeps them chained to their mistakes." "I promise," he had replied without hesitation, though at the time he could never have imagined the weight that simple vow would eventually carry. The memory struck present-day Angron with such force that the Avatar's attacks suddenly seemed insignificant, their threats rendered hollow by the realization that he was facing exactly the choice Thyra had described. He could continue fighting, continue clinging to the power and purpose that service to chaos provided, and die surrounded by the spiritual corpses of everything he had once valued. Or he could find the courage to lay down his weapons, not in surrender to his enemies, but in surrender to the possibility that something better might be possible. "You were right," he whispered, the words directed not at the supernatural forces arrayed against him, but at the memory of a woman who had died, believing that love could triumph over any form of bondage. "You were right about everything." The artifact in his palm pulsed once more, its failing power somehow responding to the clarity of his conviction with a final surge of energy that completed the work it had begun. The last neural pathways that connected him to Khorne's influence severed with an almost audible snap, leaving him standing in a silence so profound that even the sounds of battle seemed muted and distant. The butcher's nails, those cybernetic tormentors that had shaped his existence for over a century, finally went completely dark, not temporarily suppressed, but permanently disabled. The change that followed was not gradual, but instantaneous, a transformation that operated according to laws that had nothing to do with physics or biology, and everything to do with the fundamental nature of choice and consequence. The daemon essence that had comprised so much of his being since his transformation simply ceased to exist, unraveling like smoke in a strong wind and returning to whatever cosmic reservoir had originally spawned it. What remained was something that had not existed for over a century, the original physiology of a Primarch, unmarked by chaos corruption and free from external control. Yet the cost of that freedom became apparent immediately. Without the supernatural enhancements that had sustained him for so long, Angron felt the full weight of his injuries in ways that his demon form had been immune to. Every wound blazed with agony that no amount of gene-crafted resilience could fully mitigate, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat as his merely mortal biology struggled to cope with trauma that would have killed lesser beings outright. The avatars recoiled, as if struck by physical blows, their forms wavering as the spiritual anchor that had given them purpose in the material realm suddenly vanished. Without Angron's demon nature to focus their attacks upon, they found themselves increasingly unable to maintain coherent existence outside the warp. One by one, they began to fade like flames deprived of fuel, their brass weapons clattering to the ground as empty relics of a confrontation that had ended not in victory or defeat, but in transformation. "Impossible!" The largest avatar gasped, its voice distorting as its connection to the material realm grew increasingly tenuous. "You cannot simply choose to be free. No soul that has served the ruinous powers can ever truly escape their influence. The bonds are eternal, written into the very structure of reality itself." Angron looked up at the manifestation with eyes that blazed not with supernatural fire, but with the quiet intensity of absolute moral certainty. "Then perhaps," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of fundamental change at levels deeper than mere biology, "the structure of reality needs to be rewritten." The word seemed to strike the avatar like a physical blow, causing it to stumble backward as if the concept itself was somehow toxic to its essential nature. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of something that might have been fear, not of death or defeat, but of the precedent that Angron's successful defiance might set for others trapped in similar bondage. "This is not over," the manifestation warned, as its form continued to dissolve. "The Blood God's memory is long, his reach infinite. You may have escaped his direct influence, but you cannot hide from the consequences of a lifetime spent in his service. The galaxy will remember what you have done in his name, and it will not forgive." "I know," Angron replied simply, "but forgiveness was never the point. The point was proving that choice is possible, that even the most thoroughly corrupted soul can find its way back to something resembling grace if it's willing to pay the price." As the last of the avatars faded into nothingness, leaving behind only the echoes of their threats and the scattered remnants of their weapons, Angron felt something he had not experienced since his youth on Nuceria, the simple, profound peace that comes from acting in accordance with one's deepest principles, regardless of the consequences. He was free, truly free for the first time in over a century, though that freedom had cost him nearly everything he had once possessed. The World-Eaters who had chosen to follow their Gene Father's example rather than cleaving to Khorne's service approached cautiously, their own transformation still ongoing as the breaking of Angron's connection to chaos rippled outward through the psychic bonds that linked them. They saw in their Primarch not the terrifying demon prince who had led them through decades of increasingly meaningless violence, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious, proof that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from the light. Captain Khan was the first to reach Angron's side, his scarred features bearing an expression of wonder that seemed almost out of place on the face of such a hardened warrior. "My lord," he said carefully, his voice thick with emotions he was still learning to name. "What happens now? Where do we go from here?" Angron looked down at his son, seeing past the ritual scars and combat modifications to the man who had once served the Imperium's highest ideals before chaos had corrupted their shared purpose. "Now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "we learn what it means to fight for something worth preserving, instead of simply fighting because we know no other way to exist." The Daemon Primarch, former Daemon Primarch, he corrected himself, felt Thyra's memory settle into his consciousness like a warm cloak, her final gift to him across the centuries proving more powerful than any weapon he had ever wielded. She had been right about redemption being possible for even the most broken souls, and now it fell to him to prove that such redemption could be more than just personal liberation. It could be the foundation for something greater than any individual could achieve alone. The silence that followed the Avatar's dissolution was not peaceful, but hollow, like the aftermath of a great storm when the absence of wind reveals the full scope of the devastation it has wrought. Angron stood among the scattered remnants of Khorne's manifestations, his form no longer wreathed in demonic fire, but bearing the unmistakable vulnerability of mortal flesh made divine through gene craft alone. Each breath came with visible effort, his enhanced physiology struggling to compensate for injuries that his demon nature had previously rendered irrelevant. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Where supernatural essence had once flowed through his veins like liquid starfire, now only blood moved with the sluggish rhythm of a circulatory system pushed beyond its limits. The wings that had once carried him across battlefields with the grace of a hunting bird had vanished entirely, leaving behind only the memory of flight and a profound sense of loss that went deeper than mere physical amputation. Most telling of all, the burning coals that had served as his eyes since his transformation now flickered with increasingly irregular light, their hellish radiance fading like candles, guttering in their final moments. Captain Khan was the first to recognize what the others refused to acknowledge. Their gene father was dying. The realization struck him with greater force than any enemy weapon ever had, carrying with it implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of power and sacrifice. This was not the glorious death of a warrior falling in battle against overwhelming odds, but something far more subtle and infinitely more tragic, the slow dissolution of a being whose essential nature had been so thoroughly altered that returning to its original state threatened its very existence. "My lord," Khan said carefully, his voice pitched low to avoid drawing the attention of the other world eaters who were still processing the supernatural battle they had just witnessed. "You need medical attention. Apothecary Carnex could—" "No." Angron's voice carried none of its former thunder, yet somehow it possessed greater weight than any command he had issued as a demon prince. "What ails me cannot be healed by mortal medicine or gene craft augmentation. The demon essence that sustained this form for over a century is gone, and without it, this body lacks the supernatural reinforcement necessary to contain a Primarch's consciousness within merely mortal flesh." The admission hung in the air between them like an indictment, forcing both warriors to confront truths they had spent decades avoiding. Angron had not simply been enhanced by his transformation into Khorne's champion. He had been fundamentally altered in ways that made his original physiology obsolete. Removing that supernatural augmentation was like trying to force a galactic ocean back into the vessel that had originally contained a single drop of water. The attempt could only end in catastrophic failure. Around them, the surviving World Eaters were beginning to process the implications of what they had witnessed, and the reactions fell along predictable lines that spoke to the fundamental divisions within their ranks. Those who had felt their own butcher's nails fall silent in sympathy with their Primarch's liberation, approached with expressions of wonder, mixed with fear, recognizing in his transformation a reflection of possibilities they had never dared to consider. Others, whose conditioning had survived the psychic upheaval intact, backed away with visible revulsion, seeing only weakness where they had expected to find strength. Sergeant Kargoth stepped forward from the latter group, his scarred features set in grim determination as he prepared to voice concerns that echoed through the minds of nearly half the assembled warriors. "Lord Angron," he said, using the title with deliberate emphasis, "this transformation, what does it mean for the Legion? For our role in the War Master's plans, the assault on Terra requires coordination that only you can provide." The question struck at the heart of the dilemma that Angron had been avoiding since the moment his connection to Khorne had been severed. His personal redemption, however spiritually significant it might be, had consequences that extended far beyond his individual fate. The World Eaters were a crucial component of Horus's strategy for the coming siege, their brutal effectiveness in close combat serving as the hammer that would shatter Imperial defenses when the time came for the final assault. Without their Primarch's guidance, and more importantly, without the supernatural rage that had bound them together as an effective fighting force, they would be reduced to little more than heavily armed rabble. "The Legion will survive," Angron replied, though even he could hear the uncertainty that colored his words. "You are Space Marines, crafted by the Emperor's own hand to be more than mortal warriors. You do not need a gene father to tell you how to fight or when to die. You have always possessed the strength to forge your own destiny." Yet even as he spoke, Angron could see the fractures spreading through his son's ranks with the inexorable certainty of tectonic stress finally finding release. Brother Captain Drekken, one of the few officers whose nails had been damaged rather than destroyed by the psychic backlash, was already gathering those warriors who showed signs of following their Primarch's example toward something resembling redemption. They moved with the uncertain gait of men learning to walk again after a lifetime of paralysis, their conditioning warring with newfound possibilities in ways that left them emotionally adrift. On the opposite side of the formation, Sergeant Bloodspitter had assumed informal leadership of those whose loyalty remained fixed on Khorne rather than their gene father. His scarred features bore the ritual brands of total dedication to the blood god, and his eyes blazed with the familiar fire that had once defined all of their identities. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction, tempered by barely contained grief. "This is not redemption," Bloodspitter declared, his voice cutting across the battlefield with parade ground clarity. "This is apostasy of the highest order. Lord Angron may have chosen to abandon the gifts that the blood god bestowed upon him, but we are not bound by his weakness. Those who remain true to our purpose know where their loyalty lies." The division that followed was swift and surprisingly orderly, driven by philosophical differences that ran too deep to bridge through mere discussion. Roughly half of the surviving World Eaters began gravitating toward Bloodspitter's position, their movements carrying the disciplined precision of warriors who had made peace with their chosen path, regardless of its ultimate consequences. The remainder found themselves drawn to Drekken's hesitant leadership, though their steps carried the uncertainty of souls venturing into uncharted territory without any guarantee of safe passage. Angron watched the dissolution of his legion with emotions that cycled between regret and relief in equal measure. These warriors deserved better than to be trapped in the middle of their gene father's spiritual crisis, yet he could not deny the satisfaction that came from seeing some of them choose hope over certainty, Whatever happened in the immediate future, at least a portion of the World Eaters would survive to become something other than mere instruments of Khorne's endless hunger. "Captain Khan," Angron called, his voice growing noticeably weaker as the conversation progressed. "Which path calls to you?" The veteran warrior's response came without hesitation, though his words carried the weight of a decision that would define the remainder of his existence. "I follow you, my lord, not because of what you were, but because of what you have chosen to become. If redemption is possible even for those who have fallen as far as we have, then perhaps there is still hope for this galaxy after all." The simple declaration of loyalty struck Angron with an unexpected force, reminding him of bonds that transcended mere gene craft or shared conditioning. These men had chosen to follow him, not because they were compelled to do so, but because they believed his path might lead somewhere worth traveling. That trust, freely given despite the obvious risks involved, was perhaps the most precious gift he had received since his liberation from chaos. "Then listen carefully," Angron continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as his strength continued to ebb with each passing moment. "The time that remains to me grows short, and there are things you must know if you are to carry forward what we have begun here." He paused, gathering his thoughts with visible effort, as the full scope of his impending death settled upon him like a mantle of lead. This was not the quick, clean ending of a warrior falling in battle, but the slow dissolution of someone whose essential nature had been so thoroughly altered that reversing the process threatened his very existence. Yet for all the pain and uncertainty it brought, he could not bring himself to regret the choice that had led him to this point. "You will face opposition from every quarter," he told them, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "The Imperium will see only the blood on your hands, not the path you have chosen to walk away from future violence. Chaos will view you as traitors worthy only of destruction. Even those who might sympathize with your goals will question whether redemption is possible for warriors who have committed the acts that define our shared history." Captain Drekken stepped forward, his own transformation still ongoing as the remnants of his butcher's nails struggled to maintain their hold on his consciousness. "Then what would you have us do, my lord? How does one seek forgiveness for deeds that cannot be undone?" Angron's response came with the quiet certainty of someone who had wrestled with that exact question for longer than any of his sons could imagine. "You do not seek forgiveness, you earn it. One deed at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of choosing compassion over cruelty. The galaxy will judge you by your actions going forward, not by promises or declarations of intent. Show them what you have become, not what you once were." The words fell into silence that stretched like a blade drawn across taut nerves, each of the assembled warriors processing implications that challenged everything they thought they knew about purpose and identity. They were world eaters, shaped by decades of brutal conditioning to be instruments of war rather than agents of mercy. Yet their gene father spoke of compassion as if it were a weapon they could learn to wield with the same precision they brought to more conventional forms of violence. As the alien sun of Korthok Prime began to set behind the mountains that ringed their position, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed almost prophetic, Angron felt the last reserves of his strength beginning to fade. The transformation that had freed him from Khorne's influence had extracted a price that even his enhanced physiology could not sustain, and he could feel his consciousness beginning to fragment in ways that spoke of approaching dissolution. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice now so weak that the assembled warriors had to strain to hear him over the evening wind. Tell anyone who will listen, that even the most broken soul can find peace if they are willing to pay its price. Tell them that love is stronger than any chain the universe can forge, and that hope—" He paused, a smile touching his features for the first time in over a century. "Tell them that hope is the most dangerous weapon of all, because it cannot be taken by force or destroyed by violence. It can only be freely given or freely chosen. The demon Primarch, who had become simply a Primarch again, looked up at the alien stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time since his youth on Nuceria, Angron felt truly at peace with the path that lay before him. The silence in Angron's mind was absolute now, more profound than any peace he had ever imagined possible. The butcher's nails, those cybernetic tormentors that had shaped every moment of his existence for over a century, had finally ceased their eternal screaming, not temporarily suppressed, as they had been during the early stages of his transformation, but permanently silenced as the artifact's work reached its inevitable conclusion. For the first time since his youth in the gladiator pits of Nuceria, the Primarch's thoughts belonged entirely to himself, unfiltered by artificial rage or supernatural enhancement. The approaching death manifested not as pain, but as a gradual dissolution of the boundaries between consciousness and dream, memory and vision. Angron felt his awareness expanding beyond the confines of his failing physiology, touching realms of experience that seemed somehow familiar despite their impossibility. The alien landscape of Korthak Prime began to fade like morning mist, replaced by scenes that carried the weight of absolute reality, despite their origins in longing and regret. Red sand stretched before him beneath twin suns that painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Yet this was not the harsh wasteland of his nightmares, but something warmer, gentler, touched by the promise of freedom rather than the certainty of bondage. The arena walls that had defined his youth were gone, replaced by rolling hills that spoke of horizons unlimited by any master's whim. And waiting for him in the distance, their forms growing more distinct with each labored breath, stood figures whose presence filled him with joy so pure that it threatened to stop his heart entirely. Thyra appeared first, as she always had in life, not as the broken gladiator he had first met in the slave quarters, but as the woman she had become through their shared struggle against oppression. Her scars were gone, yet the strength they had represented remained, transformed into something that radiated confidence without arrogance, determination without desperation. When she smiled, the expression carried all the warmth that had sustained him through the darkest moments of their rebellion, and when she spoke, her voice held the same accent that had haunted his dreams for over a century. "You kept your promise," she said, her words echoing across the impossible landscape with crystal clarity. "You chose redemption over power, love over hatred, hope over despair. The chains are broken at last, brother. The chains are finally broken." Behind her, other figures began to materialize. The gladiator companions whose names the butcher's nails had forced him to forget, but whose faces remained eternally graven on his soul. Brom the veteran, whose tactical wisdom had complemented Thyra's strategic brilliance. Kestra the mountain-born, whose songs had helped them remember that beauty could exist even in the depths of slavery. Jorak the gentle giant, whose strength had been matched only by his unwillingness to use it against the innocent. All of them were there, waiting with expressions that spoke of forgiveness granted long before it had been sought. "We never blamed you," Brom said, his scarred features set in the same determined expression that had carried him through 30 years in the arenas. "We knew the choice you faced when the Golden Lord came. We understood what it meant to be torn between love and survival, between loyalty to us and the promise of something greater than any of us could have imagined. But you came back to us in the end," added Kestra, her voice carrying the melody that had once made their captivity bearable. "You remembered what we taught you about hope and choice and the power of love to triumph over any bondage. That is all we ever asked of you. Not perfection, but the courage to remember who you were beneath what they made you become. The visions were so vivid that Angron found himself reaching towards them with hands that no longer trembled with the constant tension of the nail's stimulation. Yet even as he stretched toward the reunion he had dreamed of for over a century, part of his awareness remained anchored in the present moment, where his surviving sons waited for words that might give meaning to the sacrifice they had witnessed. With tremendous effort, the dying Primarch turned his attention back to the assembled World Eaters, seeing in their faces reflections of the same struggle between hope and fear that had defined his own journey toward redemption. Captain Khan knelt at his side, his scarred features wet with tears that he made no attempt to hide, while Captain Drekken stood with those who had chosen to follow their Gene father's example toward something resembling grace. Even among Bloodspitter's faction, some showed signs of uncertainty as they witnessed the peaceful nature of Angron's passing. "My sons," Angron whispered, his voice barely audible, yet somehow carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "The path ahead will not be easy. The galaxy remembers what we have done in darkness, and it will take time, perhaps generations, to prove that we have truly changed. But remember this: redemption is not a destination, but a journey, not a state of being, but a choice that must be made anew with each passing day." He paused, gathering the last reserves of his strength for words that would have to sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. "You are no longer world eaters, devourers of civilizations and servants of an endless hunger. You are something new, warriors who have chosen compassion over cruelty, builders rather than destroyers. The name you carry forward must reflect that choice. Let the galaxy remember you, not for what you were, but for what you chose to become." Captain Drekken stepped forward, his own transformation still ongoing as the remnants of his conditioning warred with newfound possibilities. "What shall we call ourselves, my lord? What name could possibly encompass the change you have wrought in us?" Angron's response came with the quiet certainty of someone who had found peace with his own identity for the first time in over a century. "You are the redeemed," he said simply. "Warriors who have walked through the darkness and chosen to seek the light. Let that be your legacy. Not the blood you spilled in service to false gods, but the hope you carry for those who believe redemption is impossible." The artifact in his palm chose that moment to finally surrender to the forces that had torn it apart, its geometric patterns cracking and crumbling as the ancient mechanisms within reached the end of their operational lifespan. The device had served its purpose, unlocking chains that had bound not just one soul, but an entire legion to paths they had never truly chosen. As it dissolved into crystalline dust that scattered on the alien wind, it seemed to whisper words of farewell in languages that predated human civilization, a final benediction from makers who had understood that freedom was worth any price, any sacrifice, any cost. Angron felt his consciousness beginning to fade, the boundaries between self and universe growing increasingly fluid as his enhanced physiology finally succumbed to traumas that no amount of gene-crafted resilience could indefinitely postpone. Yet there was no fear in that dissolution, no desperate clinging to existence for its own sake. Instead, there was only the profound satisfaction that came from a life's work finally completed, a promise kept despite odds that had seemed insurmountable. The visions of his gladiator family grew stronger as physical reality weakened its hold upon him, their voices blending into a chorus of welcome that drowned out the sounds of battle still echoing across Korthak Prime. They were calling his name, not the titles that others had imposed upon him, not Lord Angron or the Red Angel or Khorne's chosen champion, but simply Angronius, as they had known him in the pits where their brotherhood had been forged. "Come home," Thyra said, extending her hand toward him across the gulf that separated life from whatever lay beyond. "Come home, brother. The fighting is over. The chains are broken. You can rest now." With his last breath, Angron spoke her name, not as a memory or regret, but as a recognition of the love that had made redemption possible even for the most corrupted soul. His eyes, which had blazed with artificial fury for so long, finally closed with an expression of such profound peace that even blood-spitters' hardened warriors felt something stir in the depths of their conditioned hearts. The Red Angel was dead, but in his death he had become something greater than any demon prince could ever aspire to be. He had become a symbol of hope for those who believed themselves beyond salvation, proof that even the most thoroughly corrupted soul could find its way back to grace if it possessed the courage to pay redemption's price. News of Angron's death spread across the galaxy with the speed of whispered rumors and official dispatches, carrying different meanings to different audiences, yet touching something fundamental in the hearts of all who heard it. Imperial commanders struggled to understand how a Chaos champion could simply choose to abandon his patron deity, while Chaos cultists recoiled from the implications of such defiance. Among the common citizens of 1,000,000 worlds, however, the story took on a different character entirely. Not the fall of an enemy, but the transformation of someone who had found strength enough to break chains that had seemed eternal. On Terra, within the golden halls of the Imperial Palace, scribes recorded the event in terms that spoke of strategic implications and tactical adjustments. Yet even they could not entirely suppress the wonder that touched their words. On distant worlds where chaos held sway, the tale was whispered in shadows by those who dared to dream that freedom might be possible even for the most thoroughly enslaved. And in the deepest reaches of the warp itself, forces that fed on despair and hopelessness found themselves weakened by the simple fact that one soul had chosen love over power. The galaxy would remember Angron not as the demon prince who had burned 1,000 worlds, but as the warrior who had proven that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from the light. His example would inspire others to seek their own paths toward grace, each choice rippling outward like stones cast into still water until the very nature of the eternal war began to change in ways that none could fully predict. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the defeat of enemies or the conquest of worlds, but the simple proof that love could triumph over any chain the universe might forge, and that hope, once kindled, could never be entirely extinguished, no matter how dark the surrounding shadows might grow.